Recognised the opposition leader Guaido, and you heard our correspondent from the US there, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. He joins us now live from New York. So let's rather get it from you, Sherwin. We got cut off there with Mike Pence. It's a complex situation. I mean, the international community deciding on the legitimacy of a leader without an election. The United States thinks Guaido is the man. What sort of response did that get in the UN?
Well, let me just finish the thought, if I may, Francis, of what Mike Pence was saying there. There was this extraordinary moment during that bike, and I'm a little unclear why the sound was lost on that, where he looked at the Venezuelan ambassador, Samuel Moncada, and told him that you shouldn't be Mr. Ambassador, with all due respect. You should go back to Venezuela and tell Nicolas Maduro to go. And that really was the theme of the US Vice President's talk to the Security Council. Of course, he's not a regular feature here, so a great deal of attention was focused on this meeting that very much was focused, Francis, on the humanitarian situation in Venezuela. Of course, we understand the geopolitical standoff that we've seen between the United States, between Washington and Caracas. We've seen the resistance of the Maduro government. He still has the support of the military, despite efforts by the United States government in terms of economic sanctions, really trying to cripple this government, to force its collapse. There's even speculation and allegations from Caracas that the blackouts we are seeing in Caracas, these weeks-long blackouts, have been at the instigation and efforts by the subversion efforts by the United States, which they've denied. But essentially the thrust of Michael Pence's statement here was that it's time for the United States to respect the rule of law, whatever that means, and to basically seat the representatives of Juan Guaido, which they believe is the legitimate representative of the Venezuelan people. He constantly referred to Nicolas Maduro as a dictator, and their big concern, certainly from the United States perspective, is that the influx of refugees from Venezuela, some 3.5 million, will cripple the entire region. There is some consensus from countries like Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia in particular, that are housing hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan refugees. So very much the focus here was the humanitarian situation in that country, and perhaps less on the efforts that Mike Pence wants to see, which is Juan Guaido replacing Nicolas Maduro's government here.
Sherwin, I understand we do have our sound back, so maybe you can give us a taste of the response, maybe starting with Venezuela itself.
Yeah, Venezuela's ambassador was in the room and, of course, had to respond to this sort of démarche from the Vice President. Sam Moncada spoke at the end of that meeting. Let's listen to what he had to say.
One key factor that has been underestimated by those who are waging war against Venezuela is the sheer strength of our national spirit, which only increases when we are faced with difficulties. This macabre experiment in destruction and bringing to its knees nations is seeking to prove that economic crimes do work for these nefarious ends, that people will eventually break and that they will cede to the oppressive foreign power. Nonetheless, in Venezuela, they have miscalculated. The collective suffering caused is resisted by growing levels of organization and determination in our people. Our Bolivarian National Armed Forces have not broken and are more united than ever. Our workers are reacting to the attacks on our infrastructure with a discipline that the aggressors are unfamiliar with and cannot boast of for themselves.
Moncada also had support from a number of council members, in particular Russia's ambassador Vasilina Benzi. I'll just read you a bit of what he said. The actions of the United States are a violation of the norms of international law, perhaps the international rules-based order that is so promoted by Western countries, and I'm quoting him here, provides for such a lawless, thuggish violation of international law. South African ambassador Jerry Machila also spoke in the council, and he called for impartial, neutral administering of international humanitarian aid to Venezuela. He also spoke to the difficulties, the economic difficulties in Venezuela as being as a result of and including factors due to the conflicting geopolitical dynamics. Quoting Ambassador Machila, it's important that the effective and unhindered provision of humanitarian assistance takes place in coordination and cooperation of the Venezuelan government. And as you well know, Francis, Pretoria recognizes the incumbency of President Nicolas Maduro and not that of interim or so-called interim President Juan Guaido.
And Sherwin, there's been some skepticism around the United States' stance. Often they're accused of self-interest, of looking at oil. Were there any sort of those sort of claims leveled today?
Certainly, the Venezuelan ambassador did mention the economic interests. Certainly, you know, Venezuela having among the largest oil reserves in the country. So that isn't certainly excluded from the conversation. But as you heard him in that soundbite talking about how the resilience of the Venezuelan people are standing up against this economic pressure. Look, the details, you know, the extent to which that is true is probably debatable. There is a humanitarian crisis on the ground there. There are urgent medical shortages. You know, there was a report done by Johns Hopkins that was published by Human Rights Watch about 5 days ago. They actually presented the findings of that report, Francis, in the Security Council. And what we hear is that there are dire economic, medical, food shortages in the country. And that's a serious concern. Over and above the geopolitical dynamics, we are seeing the people in Venezuela, the UN estimating some 7 million of them are in need of urgent humanitarian aid. That is a real concern. So the question that Germany, as the president of the session of the Security Council, what they tried to do here, Francis, was really to focus on the humanitarian response that is required. Mark Lowcock, the emergency relief coordinator, essentially the top human rights official, talking about how they do not have the requisite funds to upscale their humanitarian response. But we are certainly seeing this tussle between the geopolitical standoff in the region and the urgent need to ensure that the people on the ground are given the humanitarian aid that they so desperately require.
Yeah, the numbers are just staggering. Sherwin, before we let you go, can we talk quickly about Libya? So the UN has been preparing for elections there. There's an envoy there, but everything's scuppered because of fighting. What's the situation?
Yeah, the envoy's name is Hassan Salame, and he had been for months on end, Francis, planning what has been called a national conference, a dialogue initiative in Libya that was due to kick off on Sunday, the 14th of April. It was going to be about 3 days long. And the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, was in Libya meeting with stakeholders there when we saw the developments from this eastern militia under the command of a former general who served under Muammar Gaddafi, a guy called Khalifa Haftar, who has ordered his troops to march on the capital of Tripoli, where the internationally recognized, the UN recognized and backed government is based. We can tell you that there will be an emergency session of the UN Security Council later this afternoon around 3 p.m. our time, 9 p.m. South African time. The Secretary General is going to brief, but this is going to be behind closed doors. Clearly, this is a sensitive issue. And I think a great deal of disappointment from Guterres, Francis, about a year ago. We asked him about all the intractable conflicts around the world, and we asked him where does he see sort of a pathway to success. And he said the one conflict which he believes could be resolved within the coming months was the situation in Libya. So from a UN perspective, the devolution that we are seeing in that country is a huge disappointment. We do understand that they're working very hard to ensure that this conference gets back on track, but they will only do so once the elements of reaching success can be re-established before they sit down around that table. So it's a very precarious situation. The situation is very fluid. We look forward to hearing what the Secretary General tells Council members behind closed doors later today.
Okay, so that's all scuppered, all delayed. You'll follow that for us. Last question, Sherwin, if we can go back to the UN talks about Venezuela. I mean, where does this lead? Is there some sort of vote? The US is trying to get consensus, but is that at all likely?
Well, I think you don't need consensus in terms of the humanitarian response. I think Mark Lowcock made the point that, funders can come from, the big nations. Even the United States, it says it's going to provide $60 million in aid. So you don't need consensus in the Security Council of the General Assembly for aid or for funds to be raised for Venezuela, for Venezuelans to receive aid. International humanitarian organizations work independently of vetoes and U.S. influence here at the United Nations. So that can go ahead. What we will see in the coming coming days. Here is the United States talking about introducing a resolution to basically kick out the Maduro representatives and seat the Guaido representatives. That's going to be a tussle that I'm not sure the United States has the numbers to win.
All right, and South Africa, we know, not in support. Thank you very much for a comprehensive wrap, scrambling certainly around the very precarious situation in Libya. That was our UN correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, live from New York.